Hi photo people, I'm Allie.
And I'm Lizzie, and we're the Photo Sisters.
Today we are going to be continuing our series on how to use your camera in manual, and we're going to be covering Aperture. Lizzie, what's Aperture?
Aperture is controlled by your lens. It's not controlled by your camera, and your aperture is also known as your f-stop or your f-number. So what you need to do is locate what your aperture is on the lens that you're using. Now the maximum aperture that it has is going to be that f-number that follows the focal length of your lens. So your lens might say 18 to 55 millimeters f, 3.5 to 5.6, or it might say something like 24 to 70 millimeter f 2.8, or it might say 50 millimeter f 1.8. These are just examples. Go ahead and find that on your lens or your box lens or whatever, and once you know that, you can know the maximum aperture that you can shoot at with your particular lens.
So when you find that number, there's something you should know. They can go really, really low, like 1.2, or they can go really, really high to like 22. But it's kind of confusing because when you have, very counterintuitive. When you have a low number, it means your aperture is wide open or as big as your lens will allow it to be.
Or the maximum number. It's kind of opposite. The maximum number, or the widest aperture you can get, is the smallest number that your aperture goes to, and like this. So if you have an aperture at f1.4, it's going to be wide open like this. If you have a large number like f16, f22, then it's actually a smaller aperture or a closed down aperture. And essentially what aperture does is first of all, it controls the amount of light that's coming into your lens. So if you're wanting to shoot somewhere where it's dark and you have, barely any available light, you're going to want to shoot at a wide open aperture so that all that light can come into your lens. Like having your eyes wide open, you can get all that light coming into your lens, and that can help you avoid using a flash, and especially if you pair a wide aperture with a really high ISO, you can start shooting in places without a flash and still get really great light and pictures, that captures all the ambient light that's around you. So that's one of the great things about shooting with a wide open or a large aperture. Again, it's a smaller number.
Another thing that your aperture is going to control is your depth of field. But what that means is, think of those pictures you've seen where someone is maybe holding something in their hand and what's in their hand is crisp and clear, but maybe the person is out of focus, or
just think of like a portrait. If you see a portrait and like the person's eyes are like tack sharp, but like the rest of them, like the rest of their body and everything behind them just kind of falls out of focus, that's also shot with a really shallow depth of field, which is also a low f-stop number. That's why prime lenses like the 50mm f1.4 is so popular, because photographers love shooting at f1.4, f2.0, so that they can get those really shallow depth of field, so that they can, control that selective focus and have really great bokeh, which is background blur. And again, we'll go into another video that's talking just about bokeh, because there's different quality of bokeh depending on the lens that you're using. But again, it really depends on the lens that you're using as far as the maximum aperture and the shallow depth of field that you can get.
So when I put my camera in manual, what do I need to do with my f-stop or my aperture?
Okay, well the very first thing that you should do when you put your camera into manual is to adjust your ISO. The second thing you need to do when you decide what aperture you're going to shoot at is you're going to ask yourself a couple questions. First, you're going to ask, what type of lighting environment are you shooting in? If you're shooting inside, you're probably going to want to go lower so that you can get more ambient light in there and that you can have a properly exposed image without having to use your flash. But you also want to make sure that you're using the correct aperture, because if you're shooting at a very shallow depth of field, you're probably not going to want to shoot a group of people, or if you want, a lot of stuff in focus, you're not going to want to shoot at a shallow depth of field, because then, like, if we're not on the same focal plane, if I'm a little bit closer and you're shooting really shallow, I'm going to be in focus, but she's not. So if you're shooting a group, like a family or a couple, you're probably going to want to start at f2.0 or f2.8 so that you can make sure that you have multiple people in focus, because that's a big mistake just because you can shoot wide open and it gives you that beautiful bokeh, you still need to be really careful about making sure that if you have a group that you have everybody in focus. And Aperture, the depth of field that we were talking about, is kind of like running in lines like this. So it depends
like pieces of paper.
Yeah, it depends on the distance from you. So anything that's, you know, closer, once you focus on that, you need to make sure you take a picture, because if you move any closer or farther away, or if your subject moves any closer or farther away, they're going to be out of focus. And you know, if you're shooting at a really shallow depth of field, they can, you know, like right here, they could stop being in focus, you know, so any subtle shifts. Also, if you're using your Aperture when you're deciding your number, you also want to decide if your subject is moving really fast or if they're standing still. Because if they're moving really fast, like I was just talking about with the depth of field, they could really easily go in and out of focus. So you're going to have to be really good about, you know, keeping your focus track on them, because, you know, you could end up with a lot of totally unusable shots because they might be out of focus, you know, from moving around and changing their location from you and depth of field and everything else. But so those are the main questions. You're going to see how much available light that you have, and also the number of people that you're shooting, as well as if they're going to be standing still or moving around, because obviously it's going to be a lot easier to shoot at a wide aperture if they're standing still.
And now, don't necessarily think you have to put your f-stop as high as it possibly can go if you have little kids or a lot of people. That doesn't mean you need to move your f-stop all the way to 8 if it can go all the way down to 1.4. It means just maybe bumping it up a little bit, like Lizzie said, maybe to 2.0, 2.2, just to kind of see how that looks.
Yep. And generally, if I'm shooting a family, I usually start to shoot around f2.0, but I also like to take what I call insurance shots at f2.8 and f4.0, so I know that I at least have a handful of pictures where everybody's in focus. And if I'm shooting formals at a wedding, I'm going to usually shoot them around f4.0 or f3.5, and that's if they're all in a single line. Now, if you have a family and you have people staggered in the front, so you have now two focal distances, you're going to want to have a larger f-stop, maybe like f4.5 or f4.0, so that you can make sure that both are in focus. So kind of how we talked about in our kit lenses video, this is why it's really important to upgrade your lens to that 50mm f1.8 or even the 35mm f2.0 or the 50mm f1.4, because now you can have the option to shoot at those wider apertures, so that if you're inside, you can pair a high ISO number with a shallow depth of field or a wide aperture and be able to shoot, you know, really great images that are still properly exposed and capture all that ambient light without having to use a flash.
So how do you change your aperture? That's really, really easy to do, but different on every single camera.
Yes.
I have had Nikon cameras and a Canon Rebel and a Canon 7D, and all three are different on how to change them. So we recommend the first thing you do is go to your owner's manual to see exactly how to change your aperture.
Yes. And also, if you are using the kit lens or any type of lens that says f3.5-5.6, if you see anything that's a dash and shows two different numbers, that maximum aperture that you can shoot at depends on the focal length that your lens is at. So you need to upgrade your lens to have a fixed aperture, meaning that you can shoot at any focal length at that same aperture. That's why a lot of zoom lenses are more expensive if you get the upgraded zoom lenses. Canon makes a 24-70 f2.8 lens. That means that you could shoot at f2.8 whether you're at 24mm or zoomed into 70mm. But on those kit lenses that say 18 to 55mm f3.5 to 5.6, your maximum aperture will simply depend on the focal length that you're shooting at, so it will change according to that. So in case you run into those problems happening that your aperture is changing without you actually changing it yourself, that might be because your lens is, you know, a dash.
And so basically, like the kit lens, the 18 to 55 f-3.5 to 5.6, means at 18 millimeters, your aperture can at lowest be 3.5, but at 55 millimeters, your aperture, the lowest it can be is 5.6.
Yep, so your aperture won't change on its own unless you manually change it, unless you have that type of lens and you're changing it yourself. But if you see something that says 50 millimeters f1.8, that means that that aperture is fixed and it won't change. It can remain at that number regardless. Now, it wouldn't really make a difference on a 50 millimeter because that's a prime lens and it won't zoom anyways, but at least you get the versatility of being able to have background blur, to have really great portraits, to shoot inside with little light and no flash, and it's really helpful in that manner. So continuing with the manual mode, so make sure you change your ISO first, and then secondly you change your aperture. Now, in our third video, in our third part of the series, we're going to get to shutter speed because that will help you adjust your exposure. But essentially, if you're shooting inside and you notice that your picture is still too dark, you know, a little too underexposed, then you need to both increase your ISO as well as make your aperture wider, or you can slow down your shutter speed. But that's where we're going to talk next. So make sure you stay tuned to part 3 of our series, and in the meantime, get used to changing your aperture, judging that, knowing what lens, you know, what your lens is capable of, and possibly upgrading your lens if you haven't done so yet.
And a little bit of homework for you. Take your lens that you have and change your aperture. Put it as low as it can go, so maybe set it to 1.8 or 2.8 and take a picture. And then move that aperture as high as it can go, or maybe not as high as it can go, but maybe up to a number like 5, 6, 7, and take the same picture, and you can really see the difference of what aperture does. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, don't forget to leave us a comment in the box below.
Yep, have a great day. Thanks for watching.
Bye.
Bye.